In the year 1900, if you filled a glass of water from an American city tap and drank it, you were taking a real, measurable risk of dying. Not eventually. Not from some slow, distant cause decades down the line. Within weeks, the United States was recording roughly 100 cases of typhoid fever for every 100,000 people, every single year, and the death rate from that one disease alone sat at nearly 36 people per 100,000. In Philadelphia, more than 5,400 people died of typhoid fever in a single decade. In New York, a cook named Mary Mallon, a name history remembers as Typhoid Mary, passed the disease silently through the kitchens of some of the wealthiest families in the city, proving that money couldn't buy you out of what was hiding in the water and the food supply. This wasn't a poor country's problem. This was America, the richest, fastest-growing industrial power on Earth, and its drinking water was, on a very real statistical level, one of the most dangerous things in daily American life. And typhoid wasn't a quick, clean way to die. It meant weeks of soaring fever, delirium, a body racked with pain, and, for a fraction of the people who caught it, internal bleeding or a ruptured bowel that no doctor of the era could reliably fix. Entire families were wiped out by a single contaminated well or a single leaking pipe, and the cruelest part was that nobody could see it coming. The water looked clear. It tasted normal. There was no way, standing at your own kitchen sink in 1900, to know whether the glass in your hand was safe or a death sentence. So why did nobody fix it? Here's the thing. They didn't know how, not at the scale a real city actually needed. Doctors understood by then that these diseases spread through contaminated water. That much science had settled. But knowing the cause and stopping it citywide are two completely different problems. Filtering water through sand beds helped somewhat, but it was slow and expensive to build, and it didn't kill everything that made it through. Building new sewer systems to stop contamination at the source helped too, but that could take a city years and a fortune it usually didn't have. What America actually needed was something that could be applied to an entire city's water supply, continuously, every single hour of every single day, cheaply enough for a municipal budget to survive it. And as of 1908, nobody in the country had ever pulled that off. Not once. Not anywhere. It took a lawsuit nobody expected to matter, in a mid-sized city most Americans still can't place on a map, to change that forever. Jersey City, New Jersey, sat directly across the Hudson River from Manhattan in 1908, a booming railroad and industrial hub of roughly 200,000 people. In 1899, city leaders signed a contract with the Jersey City Water Supply Company to finally solve their water problem for good. The plan was ambitious: dam the Rockaway River, flood a valley to create a massive new reservoir at a place called Boonton, and run a pipeline 23 miles straight into the city. On paper, it was an engineering triumph. The Boonton Reservoir alone could hold more than 7 billion gallons of water. The dam went up, the pipeline went in, and on May 4th, 1904, water from the brand new system reached Jersey City homes for the first time in the project's history. There was just one problem, and it was the same problem every American city had at the time. The water received no treatment of any kind before it reached anyone's tap. None. It ran straight from an open reservoir, exposed to runoff, to wildlife, to whatever drained into it upstream from farms and forests, directly into the pipes of 200,000 people, completely untouched. Residents noticed, officials noticed. And the argument over whether this brand new, hugely expensive water supply was actually safe to drink didn't stay a quiet disagreement for long. It became a lawsuit. The city of Jersey City, suing its own water company in open court, arguing that what it had paid years and a fortune for wasn't pure and wholesome water at all, but exactly the same contaminated risk the city had started with. Now picture the position that put the water company in. Years of construction behind them, a fortune already spent on a dam, a reservoir, a 23-mile pipeline, and now a judge sitting across a courtroom, effectively telling them that none of it counted, that the entire multi-year project could be ruled a total failure, unless they could prove, and prove fast, that the water itself was genuinely safe to drink. The deadline the court handed down was brutal, a little over 90 days. 90 days to solve a public health crisis that had been quietly killing thousands of Americans a year for decades. New sewers to stop the contamination at its source? That takes years, not months. A full mechanical filtration system, sandbed style, the way a handful of cities had experimented with. Also far too slow and far too expensive to build from nothing in 3 months. Every conventional option sitting on the table was, quite simply, too slow to survive the clock the court had just started running. And if the deadline passed with nothing to show for it, the entire 23-mile pipeline and the reservoir behind it could be ruled worthless, sending Jersey City back to square one and back to whatever contaminated wells and cisterns it had relied on before. So what was left? A physician working as the water company's sanitary advisor had an idea nobody particularly wanted to hear. His name was Dr. John L. Leal, and since the late 1890s, he'd been quietly experimenting on his own with what he called electrolytic solutions of salt. Early, small-scale attempts at using chemistry to kill bacteria in water rather than simply filtering it out. He knew of a handful of small experiments in Europe suggesting that chlorine compounds could destroy the exact pathogens behind typhoid and dysentery. But here's what made his idea genuinely radical. Nobody had ever tried it on an entire American city's water supply, at full scale, running continuously, forever. And here's why that mattered so much. At the turn of the 20th century, most scientists and doctors considered the idea of deliberately putting chlorine, a poisonous chemical by their own explicit description, into a public drinking water supply, not just reckless, but close to unthinkable, arguably illegal. You were talking about intentionally dosing the water an entire city drank, cooked with, bathed in, and gave to its infants, with a chemical everyone agreed could kill a person in the wrong amount. If Leal's calculations were even slightly off, this wasn't going to be filed away as a policy failure. It would be a mass poisoning, with his own name attached to the decision, in front of a judge who was already watching his every move. He proposed it anyway. Around the same time, in a strange historical coincidence, engineers at Chicago's Union Stockyards had also been experimenting with chlorine, not on drinking water, but on the filthy, polluted stream used to water livestock. Their results were striking. The chlorine-treated stockyard water actually came out purer than the city's own tap water. It was proof that the underlying chemistry worked. Jersey City would be the first place in America to bet an entire city's health on it. There wasn't time or the right equipment to produce pure chlorine gas or liquid bleach at the scale the plan required. That electrolytic technology simply did not exist yet in a deployable form. So, Leal partnered with a sanitary engineer named George Warren Fuller, widely regarded as the finest in the country at the time. And together, the two of them designed something more improvised and far riskier than anything either man had attempted before. A plant at the Boonton Reservoir that would continuously feed a carefully calculated dose of chloride of lime, ordinary bleaching powder, directly into the water the instant it left the reservoir, before a single drop ever reached a pipe leading into the city. The math had to be exact, and there was no room for error in either direction. Too little chlorine, and the bacteria survived, and the entire plan failed in the most public way possible. Too much, and they would be handing their critics exactly the poisoning scandal everyone feared, dosing 200,000 people with more chemical than their bodies could safely handle. Fuller and Leal had to calculate a dose precise enough to kill what needed killing, while staying far below anything that could harm a human being drinking it every day for the rest of their life. And they had to get that calculation right the first time, in public, with a judge counting down the days. They had roughly 3 months, no prior American example to copy, no safety net if the science was wrong, and a courtroom waiting to rule against them the moment they missed the deadline. They built it anyway. On September 26, 1908, the chlorination plant at Boonton went live, and for the first time in American history, a major city's entire water supply flowed continuously through a chemical disinfection process before it ever reached a home, a school, or a business. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No headlines, no parade. Most residents of Jersey City had no idea their water had changed at all, which, in its own quiet way, was exactly the point. But within weeks, the health department's own numbers started telling a story nobody could argue with. Typhoid fever cases in Jersey City were falling, and they kept falling. The lawsuit still needed a final answer. A second trial was held specifically to determine whether the water company had actually met the court's original demand, whether this newly chlorinated water genuinely qualified, in the court's own language, as pure and wholesome. Expert witnesses were called. Leal himself testified, defending a method that half his own profession still considered dangerous just months earlier. The verdict came back, yes. And that single ruling did something far bigger than settle one contract dispute in one New Jersey courtroom. It handed the entire American water industry both legal cover and scientific proof that continuous chlorination actually worked. The response was almost immediate. Philadelphia, a city that had already buried more than 5,000 of its own residents to typhoid in a single decade, added chlorination to its own water supply just 1 year later, in 1909. Within a decade of that first plant going live at Boonton, chlorination had spread to nearly every large city in the United States. By 1941, 85% of American cities were treating their municipal water with chlorine as a matter of daily, unremarkable routine. And the numbers that followed weren't incremental. They were staggering. The national typhoid death rate, sitting at nearly 36 per 100,000 people in 1900, had collapsed to under 5 per 100,000 by 1928, a decline of roughly 86% in under 30 years. In the cities hit hardest by the disease before treatment, the collapse was even sharper. Pittsburgh alone saw its typhoid death rate fall by 95% from pre-treatment levels. Diseases that had been killing tens of thousands of Americans every single year, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, didn't just decline in chlorinated cities. In most of them, the diseases were functionally wiped out. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how large that shift actually was. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has called water chlorination and filtration the single most significant public health achievement of the entire 20th century, ranked above the discovery of antibiotics, above modern surgery, above nearly everything else medicine accomplished in that 100-year span. Life expectancy in the United States rose by roughly 50% over the course of the 20th century, and clean water treatment alone is estimated to account for nearly half of that increase. Not a new drug, not a new vaccine. Water, the single most basic, most completely ignored substance in your entire day, quietly did as much to keep Americans alive as almost anything else in modern medical history. Here's the part of this story that's easiest to lose. John Leal never got to watch any of that unfold. He died on March 13, 1914, at just 55 years old, barely 6 years after that first chlorination plant went live at Boonton, and years before his method became standard practice across the vast majority of American cities. He staked his entire professional reputation, and arguably his legal standing, on a 90-day deadline and an idea most of his own peers considered dangerous, even illegal. And he was gone before the country ever fully understood the scale of what he'd actually built. Think for a second about what that means for you, specifically, wherever you're sitting right now. Every glass of water you've ever safely poured from a kitchen tap in America, every ice cube, every pot of pasta water, every single time you've brushed your teeth without a second thought about whether the water itself might make you sick. All of it traces directly back to a court-ordered 90-day deadline in a New Jersey courtroom, and one physician willing to risk everything on an idea his own profession considered too dangerous to try. That's the pattern behind nearly everything this channel exists to dig up. The invisible systems holding up your entire daily life, systems you have never once had a reason to think about, that feel like they have simply always existed, when in reality, somebody had to invent them under real pressure, defend them in a courtroom, and prove them correct before anyone could be sure they would actually work, often without ever living to see how far the idea would eventually travel. Before the grid, before the pipe, before the switch, before the system, someone had to build the first version, with no guarantee it would hold. If stories like that are your kind of thing, subscribe, because there is a lot more running quietly beneath the surface of your everyday life than you have ever had a reason to think about until now.